So let's take a look at some bad sampling that has happened. These are actually real, they have happened. Please read example 11.3 and answer A through C. So please pause the video and take care of that. Okay, so here's the thing. This happened back in 1977. So I'm just going to, first of all, well, let's actually go through A through C first. Identify the population of interest. Well, we were interested in the opinions of all adult Americans that Elvis was still alive. So the population of interest is all adult Americans. The sample are the callers, the people who called in. The variable of interest is whether they think Elvis is dead or not. As categorical binary, he's either dead or he's not dead. And the 56% is based, is based on the sample, so it has to be a statistic, as it is based on the sample. Now, do you think the 56% is an accurate reflection of beliefs of all Americans on this issue? And if not, identify the primary flaw. And I'd say, first of all, no. Now, I remember when Elvis died, my grandmother had, I think it was Star or Inquirer, anyways, and she was just devastated because she loved Elvis. Back then, this is 1977, and you had to pay $2.50 to call. I made a buck an hour babysitting. All right. So $2.50 was a decent amount of money. Also, you had to be listening to one of the radio stations one of those 1,000 radio stations where you even asked to call the 1-900 number. So first of all, that's not, I mean, yeah, 1,000 radio stations is a lot, but it's not a ton. And you had to be listening when they actually asked you to call the 1-900 number. Now, do you think people who in general didn't care would bother to call? Or do you think it would only be people who felt really strongly? And the answer is it's the people who felt really strongly, very strongly, in particular, that Elvis is still alive. It's biased towards not dead. And the big thing is you had to voluntarily call to actually give your feedback on this. So voluntary response is the big issue here. Now, please take a moment and read through the Literary Digest versus Gallup, and please answer part A and then come back. So there are a few key things that I want to point out, as hopefully you may have noticed them as you read them. The first thing I noticed is with the Great Depression in full swing, oof, that's going to change a lot of what was going on. And we're also looking at 1936 as we think about these things. Okay, so we did the population of interest as all American voters, or you could have said all American adults, either would have been fine. The sample is 24 million 2.4 million Americans. Those are the number of responses. They sent out 10 million, but only 2.4 million actually sent them back. The parameter that we're interested in is the proportion who will vote for Landon. And the statistic that they found was 0.57, and that's the sample proportion who said they would vote for Landon. Now, this looks good. So we've got the basic information. Now, questionnaires were sent out to 10 million people. Back in 1936, that was a good chunk of the population, one would think. But even so, how did those questionnaires go out? The subscribers the people they got were subscribers to the magazine and from phone books and from vehicle registration lists. Remember, the Depression is full swing, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of the Dust Bowl. It was a horrible time. There were bread lines. I remember my grandmother talking about not even having a phone and not having electricity, to be honest. So back in 1936, who do you think were able to afford to subscribe to magazines, to actually have a phone and a phone number, and to have a vehicle? And you're probably thinking the wealthy. That would be correct. So Alf Landon actually received 36.5% of the votes. Did the Literary Digest result even come close? And hopefully you're thinking right away, no, not even close. The Literary Digest's extremely misleading result can be blamed on how the 2.4 million people in the sample were selected. First, explain why you might have expected the sampling method to be biased in favor of a Republican challenger based on how the names and addresses were obtained. And we've already talked about that. It was during the Great Depression. It was the wealthy who could afford the magazines, the phone, vehicle. Um, yeah. So household income would be high. Um, so there we go. Not all res Could I say that already that there's some things wrong with this? Sure. I mean, first of all, it is voluntary response, right? Right away, we see with any sort of survey, voluntary response is a possibility. What about some of the other things that are wrong? Well, under coverage, it did not cover anyone who did not have a phone, who did not subscribe to the magazine, or who did not have a car. So that left out the vast majority of Americans. So now explain how the poor prediction can also be based on how people decide to participate in this survey. You're going to notice that not all people responded. Do you think people who were happy with the status quo and people who were unhappy with status quo are equally likely to mail back that survey? Remember, the survey probably didn't even have a stamp on it, so you're also going to have to stamp it, take it to the post office, or get it out to your letterbox. Not all, like we said, not all responded. They sent out 10 million and they only got 2.4 million back. People who wanted change were more likely to respond. All right. So even though the fiasco, a literary digest fiasco, excuse me, again illustrates the difficulty of selecting a representative sample from a population, even when a very large sample is selected. Voluntary response is an issue with many surveys because those who choose to respond may be systematically different than those who chose not to respond. Also, again, be aware that issues not associated with sampling should be considered when drawing conclusions from the results. People often give inaccurate replies as a result of poorly worded questions, they can't remember things, or they simply lie. Maybe they don't want to admit, or on a survey, maybe they don't want to say that they're over 65 and they put in that they're 45. Right there, it's going to start messing up what data is collected. So important things to remember. Sample size does matter, first of all, and governs the precision of estimates. No, we're not going to get too deeply into this, but we want to remember that sample size n should be just right, not too big, not too small. With small samples, we might miss certain sections of the population, so the sample is not truly representative. On the other hand, if the samples get too large, we're wasting resources because sending out those like 10 million, in that case, surveys cost money. It wasn't free. All right. So there's that law of diminishing returns. But here's where we come down to. Here's the crux of the matter. Drawing conclusions from a study. A random sample is the only mechanism that allows inferences from the sample back to the population. Increasing the size of a bad sample, of a non-random sample, will not help us recover from the bias that's inherent in non-random samples. Okay, so even if you have a non-random sample, you're like, I'll just make it bigger, it'll help. Well, it certainly didn't help with the literary digest example. Didn't help at all. And in the case of surveys, it's not just enough to find you have to get the right sample size. You also need to think about the questions and how you're going to administer it. And as you administer it, excuse me. Wording the questions, order of the questions can really change how people answer questions. So biases that can come up are non-response bias. People choose just not to respond to the survey, won't answer a question. Response bias, they lie, forget, lots of things. Measurement error, you can have a bad, you could record the wrong answer, for instance. So in this Calvin and Hobbes, great example of a survey issue. So here we go. I'm filling out a reader survey for Chewing Gum magazine. They ask how much I spent on gum each week. So I wrote $500. For my age, I put 43. And when they ask what my favorite flavor is, I wrote garlic curry. And then we hear this magazine should have amusing ads soon. I love messing with the data. Generally speaking, it's not quite that dramatic, but hey, you think about it. If it's just a survey anyone can fill out and send in, you get what you get. Now we're going to end on a good note here. Farm to table, according to Gallup poll, they actually did a telephone interview. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. This is an interview survey kind of thing. This probably isn't going to be good. Well, Gallup actually is a solid source. And they actually tell you, as they conducted these interviews, they tell you how they did it, how they got the data. They also looked at cell phones and landlines. They looked at time zones. They considered a lot of things. So I would have, even though you're like, well, telephone interview, like a survey, this doesn't seem like it's going to get us anything useful. The way they set it up, they did get some good data. They tell us how they got the data, and it's actually, and Gallup is a good source. So just because it's a survey doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, not all surveys are bad. It's more you just need to think about how the survey is set up, how the questions are worded, and how you're getting the people to, how you're getting your participants in the survey. And that takes care of the basics of sampling.